The future has arrived. As the world and humanity itself moves faster and faster into unimaginable possibilities, old institutions that built connection and shaped our sense of meaning are falling by the wayside. In their wake, profound questions about ethics, our purpose, and spirituality demand new answers. Join your host, Scott Mason, in Season 2 of the Purpose Highway podcast. We will explore how these social changes will revolutionize our society. We will learn how they impact our own search for connection and meaning. And we will hear stories of influencers whose lives have had radical change from the inside and found profound connection to others and themselves through a new definition of meaning. The future has arrived. Are you ready?
When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA crafts small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's NOLA's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's NOLA is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's ITSNOLA.com. Guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's NOLA's website for yourself and find out how good it is. Hello, everybody. It's Scott Mason, revving up for another race down the Purpose Highway. If you like what we're doing, be sure to subscribe and give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a review on Apple. Now, sitting next to me today in the front seat is Richard Schell. Richard is a professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School. He is the author of 5 books, including The Conscience Code, Lead with Your Values, Advance Your Career. His book, Springboard, Launching Your Personal Search for Success, was named Business Book of the Year by the largest business bookseller in the United States and was shortlisted for Management Book of the Year by the British Library. His best-selling book on negotiation, Bargaining for Advantage, is required reading at many business and law schools. And his titles have sold over 500,000 copies in 17 languages. His legal scholarship has been twice cited by none other than the United States Supreme Court, and he has taught everyone from Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and Fortune 500 CEOs to FBI hostage negotiators, Navy SEALs, and United Nations peacekeepers. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. A great pleasure to be here.
It is a great pleasure to have you. Richard, let's just go right in for the bang. This season's theme has been around what I call the silent revolution. It's a revolution of thought, particularly around the historical institutions, including and perhaps especially organized religions that have framed and even enforced ethical codes throughout both our culture and many others. These institutions, the data has repeatedly shown, are in decline. Do you feel, Richard, that secular institutions like businesses can or should step in and take their place?
Oh, great question. I mean, I think educational institutions such as the Wharton School, a business school, are they're sort of secondary to the primary value creation and cultural institutions that religion is an example of. So I think it's very difficult to rely on that kind of institution to instill values. My dad was a general in the Marine Corps, and it's not that values can't be instilled later in life. I was a kid, and we lived on the Marine base in Parris Island, South Carolina, where Marines are trained. And I was, even as a young person, a kid, really just astonished to see the transformation in a person who came in as a scruffy-looking teenager, and then, a few short months later, marched out behind a banner as a United States Marine with a whole different step and a whole different look in their eyes. So I think it's possible for secular institutions, and the military is one, to instill values and to create self-discipline and to kind of provide some of the sort of superstructure that all of us require to live successfully. But I don't think we can look at universities or business schools for that kind of structure. I myself think of the business school world that I teach in as a place where we remind people and prioritize, help them remember that they should prioritize the values they brought to us. And some of them are coming from religious traditions. Some of them come from a kind of combination of secular and religious traditions. Mostly they come from families. And a lot of what I do is try to remind people of the values that their families tried to instill from whatever sources the families were absorbing them from, and then just reinforce them as a professional matter. So I'm pessimistic that institutions like the ones I'm part of can do the work. We can only amplify.
And in terms of being pessimistic about that, why?
I think a lot of what goes into the formation of values is the intensity with which those values are communicated and reinforced in a social context. And if you think of, again, I can go back to the Marine Corps recruit training, it's surround sound, 24/7, you're got this whole new set of values that's being instilled in you, and there's not a minute off. It's reinforced, reinforced. And I think when you're growing up in a family, although you're not as aware of it and that being that kind of intensiveness, unless it's maybe an abusive family where you actually feel that kind of coercion, it's still 24/7. And a lot of what's going on is unconscious on the part of the parents and the children, where children are modeling their behavior of what they see their parents doing. They're listening to the way the values are discussed and the way that outside events are discussed. All that kind of processes. So if you take a value like honesty or compassion, the early lessons that will be learned in a family might just be, Johnny, you broke the vase. You shouldn't lie about that. We'll forgive you. You can help us figure out if we can repair it. And there's a kind of a moment, a teaching moment that might occur around honesty. And business schools and educational institutions do their best in reinforcing some of the basic values like that. They may have an honor code, or they may have a pledge you sign about cheating. But it's pretty weakly communicated. It's only episodic, and it's rarely enforced in an intensive way. The social structure just is too widespread, too sort of loosey-goosey. The intensity, I think, is what brings the value to the deep level of unconscious motivation.
Yet, according to a 2020 survey by Deloitte, only 51% of millennials see business as a force for good. And that's down from 76% in 2017. And only 1/3 see business leaders as having a positive impact on them. If we feel that business doesn't have the capacity or really isn't the right place to be part of the ethical stew that we swim in every day, how can we begin to think about that changing? Or do you think that that's really something that maybe we should just throw our hands up and say we accept?
No. I didn't say business couldn't be a force for good or couldn't be a source of values. I said that it's very rare that you would see an institution like business be the original source of these values. And I think people, when I teach negotiation, I like to say people negotiate. Countries don't negotiate. Companies don't negotiate. And businesses are people. And I think what we try to do in our courses and what I try to do in my executive programs is bring people in business to a sense of integration. Because what it tends to happen is there's a separation. People see a lot of what we do, we define ourselves by the roles we play. This became very obvious to me when I first became a parent. I was, we brought home we have two sons, and we brought home our first son from the hospital, and we were in our apartment in Boston, and, it was time to change the diaper, and I went, oh my God, I'm a dad.
Yeah, right.
It's like
that hit at home.
This is it, And there was no like, hey, I'll trade this in. I think I'll take a buy. Sounds like 2 weeks off, please. This was it. 24/7 dad, and learning to play the role of dad. Of course, what did I draw on? I didn't know it, but I drew on my dad and my dad's relationship to my mom. And all these things that had been inchoate before that moment when I assumed that role, and I realized I had the role. I mean, there's a moment of like terror where you go, my gosh, I've got this role. And I think that happens to people in business and professional life. You're a lawyer, or as I am a fully recovered lawyer, but there was a day in your professional life when you graduate from law school and you join whatever professional firm or company you first worked for, when you suddenly noticed someone looked at you and they expected you to be the lawyer. And up to that point, you'd been a law student or you'd been whatever, and you just sort of went, holy smoke, you're going to rely on me to be a lawyer? And so at that moment where the role became vivid, that's where the integration that we try to make vivid for students and executives takes place, because there's not just a separate, you're not just like a lawyer, like there's a robot called a lawyer, and then there's the rest of you. There's you occupying this role. And then the question is, okay, how do I integrate my true self, my authentic self, my home self, my community self into this professional self, and bring the appropriate parts of my professional identity and my personal identity together and be effective. Now, there are certain things we don't want a professional lawyer to do in the role of lawyer. We don't want them to use a client conference to try to convert the client, to some religious cult. And that's just inappropriate, right? Even though it's strongly felt valued by the person occupying the professional role. So I think the part I take hope from is what's going on is there's a lack of integration between the personal and the professional realm over certain basic values that ought to be informing both sides of the life. And these are values like compassion for suffering, honesty and transparency, values like fairness and justice, dignity. These are things that you would want to be held dear at home, and you'd want them to be held dear in the school district where your child goes to school, and you'd want them to be held dear in the company you work for or the legal firm that you're a lawyer in, because they are transcendent values that all form the superstructure for professional life. It isn't some special occasion. the lawyer role is justified by its embodiment of the value of justice and honesty and compassion. So what happens is people get preoccupied. There's a wonderful psychological phenomenon called inattention blindness. Have you ever heard?
No,
of that one,
I have
Scott?
not, although I fear that I might have it every now and then. And actually, I correct that because I believe you discussed it in your book. And
Yeah, I did. And there's a wonderful YouTube video that your listeners can go to called The Invisible Gorilla.
Yes.
And there's some wonderful research that goes to this inattention blindness. But, fundamentally what it is, it's a big, funny psychological term, but the real essence of it is you're distracted by one thing in your life and you don't see the stuff sitting right in front of you. And, an easy example is you're distracted by the conversation you're having with a passenger in the car and you don't see the child crossing the road in front of you. So it's there, the child's there, you're looking right at them, but you don't see them. And I think what happens in professional life is people get preoccupied with the competition, with the deadline, with the expectations that the stock market might have, or the expectation the boss has, and they stop seeing the values that are being violated because they don't see them. They're blind to them in that moment. And I think it's really what our job is as educators in the business school world is to point out that that's a very likely thing to happen, and then put the red light, yellow light in play so that their minds are associating this sort of pressure to make a competitive goal or to give way to the boss as a signal.
Right.
Watch out, watch out, watch out. Inattention blindness moment ahead. And remember their values. Remember honesty first. Remember family first. Remember compassion and a relief of suffering, protection of the innocent. And that value transcends this particular moment where the value that the firm is embracing to win or to produce or to make the client deadline. And that's, those are swamping the right stuff. And so it's not that people don't have the values. I think it's that people are incented to forget them.
Well, what I'm hearing you talk about is related to two of the themes that I personally noticed reading your book, The Conscience Code. One of which you made more explicit. The other, which I don't recall it being as explicit, but it's absolutely embedded in what you're saying. And it, in a way, once you absorb the whole idea of having ethics as something that's specifically guiding you throughout your professional journey, it almost goes without saying. But I also believe nothing ever goes really without saying because there's someone who needs to hear it. So yeah, concept number one is the idea of ethics and ethical thinking as a disciplined practice that you talk about with a sense of making and understanding and prioritizing the small little decisions that we make every day. But number two, and this is the one that I saw as a little bit more subtly embedded in your work, but nonetheless there, the idea of being self-aware of our own limitations, dispositions, and our relationship to the environment that we're in. So, for instance, what you were talking about earlier, being self-aware that it's possible due to some of the expectations about what is professional or not in the workplace, we may not be fully integrating ourselves into the job. Therefore, in that process of severing our professional selves from our authentic selves, we leave behind ethical constructs that may be guiding our lives elsewhere. Another example of that might be being self-aware, as you talk about in more detail, and we'll discuss at one point during this interview, who and what we are as personality types in the job and how that can impact the ethical decisions that we make, not to mention how we assess those that may be under our supervision and are working with us as we look at them. For instance, as you and I discussed pre-interview, there's a test in your book which I took, and it described my personality type in a workplace as someone that was very concerned with getting the job done and coming up with win-wins. I wasn't totally obsessed with being a people pleaser at all costs, but at the same time, I also had an understanding that at least when it came to negotiations or navigating difficult circumstances, maintaining the relationships with those around me had value. Now that is placed at a premium in a lot of large organizations, but other personality types, the ones that are concerned with their values, and they don't care whose head they butt against, well, some organizations have a problem with that. And so I am curious as to your thoughts as to tools people might have or be able to utilize or pull from within when they're in their work lives to be able to make sure that they are conscious of that self-awareness, number one, and number two, practicing this stuff all the time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. Let me go back to the parent thing for a second. So once you're a parent, do you ever forget that you're a parent?
Well, that's scary if you do.
Unless you're asleep. I mean, your children won't let you forget, right? Your duty is there. Every time you walk in the door or walk out the door, or the phone rings and your kid's sick or whatever it is, it's with you. You're now a parent, and that's part of who you are. And I think this is the same thing when it comes to values at work. I think one of the most important things people can do to bring this sense of self-awareness to their day-to-day life at work is to think of themselves as a person of conscience. Someone who has values, and they implement those values at home by duty and habit. I mean, if you're a parent, you're not going to leave your child alone in the cereal aisle and go wandering off and looking to see if the butcher might want to talk to you. Your duty as a parent would completely transcend the urgency of getting to the butcher counter. And when you're a person of conscience, which most people are, I mean, I think this is not something anyone has to be sold on. A good person is a person of conscience. They're someone for whom values matter. Now, there are very few, roughly 3% of people, who are psychopaths. And they have no conscience. They have no empathy. They have nothing but self-interest. And they can't be appealed to on the basis of anything related to values. And they're extremely adept at manipulating the rest of us. My book is not for them. There's no way to convert them. That's a genetic problem. But the rest of us are, and don't have much trouble identifying ourselves as being people of conscience. So then one of these moments happens at work where you're somewhat disturbed. You recognize a variation in the pattern of your professional life in that someone's asked you to put a date on a report that actually is backdating the report. And the boss just says, don't worry about it. Everybody does it. And if you're just thinking about yourself as a professional and you think, well, the boss is a professional, done it longer than me, maybe they're right, maybe everybody does do it, and you surrender your values to that professional role. You become complicit in someone else's vision of that professional role. If, on the other hand, you say to yourself, well, this is disturbing, what would a person of conscience do in this situation? For the most part, I think the answer to that is usually do something. That is, ask a question, clarify, get more information, make sure that and confirm that this actually is a standard practice that everybody does. Because your discomfort is that inner voice that is always there and that is telling you, if you let this moment pass and agree to do something you're uncomfortable about, two things may happen. One, you will come to regret it and have great remorse because you'll become part of a conspiracy that you want nothing to do with, which is the worst case scenario in some ways. And the other is you'll become inured to it. And the little voice will suddenly get dimmer and quieter. And then you're part of a system that's corrupt. And now you're corrupt. And that's worse. In a sense, you've sold your soul just to avoid a moment when you ask the boss a question. Hardly seems like a good trade-off. So that question, what would a person of conscience do, is a way of prompting yourself to ask the right kind of questions, to investigate yourself, to interrogate your values, and then to think, okay, there's really some problem here. It's not a very big one, but it's a little one. What should I do? Now, that's a whole different category question than whether I should do something. And I think my whole agenda is to wake people up to the fact that they're people of conscience and that they're people of conscience in more than one part of their lives, to bring that, to integrate that into their professional role, whether they're a warehouse worker, a lawyer, a waiter, or a financial auditor, and then give them toolkits, tactics, options about what to do now that they've gotten that self-awareness to wake themselves up. And so I think we're not that far in any individual case from having people become more proactive and effective, implementing their values and becoming vocal about their values in a work setting. But we sort of let the whole dialogue about this just be taken over by the imperatives of goals, outcome goals, productivity goals. And we just sort of say, well, that's work, and we'll just, different rules apply. And I don't think so. When you're lying on your deathbed, those are the things that are going to come back, and you're going to say, did I do it? Did I do the right thing? Did I do what I could have done in that situation?
Your book, The Conscience Code, was so rich, contained so much in terms of actionable thinking triggers, as well as processes and techniques that we can use to move ourselves more and more in that direction, that it honestly could require, for a thorough discussion of both it and the implications of what you were writing about, a whole 5 or 6 hour podcast. That being said, even in the little discussion you had of a tiny part of it right a minute ago, there are a zillion different tentacles that we could all pull from and begin to have conversations about. I'll focus on 2. First of all, you mentioned in passing that there are these group of people that are psychopaths that are maybe 2 or 3% of the population, and that we're not really talking about in this conversation because they're not going to be people of conscience no matter what. That being said, let's face it, they're the ones that get promoted. They're the ones that we have to deal with. So, and the reason why I mention that is because we all operate within the corporate cultures that we have. And if they have those sort of people at the top, and they do, I maybe not universally, but it's hard to argue that they don't end up at the top with some frequency. It almost makes you want to just throw up your hands. Not only that, but when it comes to the examples of the people that might be asked, for instance, to backdate that document, that story, for those who are watching or listening, is a very tiny snippet of a very dramatic and startling story that you share in a book full of very, very dramatic, startling, I would even say terrifying stories that leads to where this question is ultimately going. Another one of those stories involved a financial scandal, and I'll never forget, one of the players in it was just a bookkeeper who made an entry. She was told to do this entry, and she did it. Her life ended up being destroyed because of this complicitness.
Well, the pressure, this was the WorldCom scandal, and one of the biggest scandals in the 20th century. The pressure was put on her and one colleague to put a false entry in the books. It was not even presented as a false entry. It was a stretch of an accounting principle in order to make a quarterly reporting deadline. And they were assured that it was just this once. And they were assured that they were doing it for the company, that the company needed them to do this. So they had all of those false signals of loyalty and, very limited scope. Yeah. And then they did it. And as soon as they did it, they became part of the conspiracy because after they did it, they had to help cover it up. And then they had to do it again. And then they had to do it again to cover up the cover up. And, that's that little moment. It was just a day at the office.
Yeah.
They didn't expect this to, and they knew they were doing something wrong. They knew it. They told the author of the book that I drew this story from, they knew it at the time, but they allowed themselves to be drawn in by the beguiling and sort of charming statement that they were going to do this as part of the greater good. And then it ended up bringing down a company that cost 40,000 jobs and many, many billions of dollars as these leaders. I'm not sure the leaders were psychopaths in the clinical sense. I think they themselves had completely lost their bearings. It's interesting how you can incrementally go from being a good person to being a Nazi, and not even be aware that you've made the transition. And corporate leaders, I think, sometimes do that. But they had the chance, and they backed away from it, and the consequences were very severe. I mean, just to get one, let me just say one thing about your underlying question. When you have a psychopath in the picture, and it's a clinical definition for that, so it's hard. I'm not a psychologist to define an example. Who's a current psychopath we can point to? But they are the enemy. I mean, it seems to me, I'm trying to write a book to help the 97%. I can't write one to help the 3, but I can help the 97 identify the 3 and defeat them. This is where criminal law, this is where whistleblowing, this is where coalitions of the willing, this is where the hardest ball tactics that people can come up with are necessary to defeat the psychopath who is trying to steal everybody's soul and their wealth and their family security. Now, they're nothing less than a barbarian attacking your family.
I actually don't think that the starkness of that metaphor is unjustified. We choose not to see it that way because we live in these work environments day after day after day. And so one of the scary things about toxic work environments in particular is that they deaden us to our humanity. I would love to hear any practical tips you have for someone who might be watching or listening who's working in one of those environments. I've been there, and God knows, Richard, working for the government as long as I did, I've experienced it and seen people. You become so dead inside that the concept of you as a person, once you clock in to that work, let alone a person possessing a thing called conscience, you're so dehumanized that even raising yourself to the level of humanhood, let alone humanity, it's almost too far to grasp.
It's hard.
What do you say to someone
it's
like
hard.
that?
Well, of course, you're talking about somebody who's already halfway down the river because they have let themselves become complicit earlier when there was their sensitivities were still alert. But we don't have to look too far to see that sensitivities may be dulled, but they seldom go away. And we just had an example of the governor of New York who has been misbehaving in the office with respect to sexual behavior for a long time and getting away with it. And I'm sure there were a lot of people, in fact, some pretty otherwise upstanding people in nonprofits and other groups that are supportive of women's rights who allowed themselves to become complicit in helping him cover up and attack his accusers. And they themselves got sucked into this vortex of power and influence and probably talked themselves into thinking they were doing something for the greater good. But nevertheless, there were those voices, the little people, the woman who refused to stand down. And I tell your listeners one thing: never take this journey alone. The damage comes when you allow yourself to be isolated, when you allow yourself to be minimized and marginalized, and you know what's going on is toxic. You know it's wrong, but you don't speak because you think you're the only one. And there is always someone else, always. And one of the first things I say in the book, and I say it over and over, is believe in the power of two. Believe in the power of two. And so as soon as this uneasiness begins to get evoked in you, and that's your conscience speaking, emotionally it feels like uneasiness or anxiety, but that's where it's coming from. Then your job is to seek out a fellow to speak with. Now, that could be someone at home. It doesn't have to be someone at work. But someone who will say, I understand what you're saying, and you're right. This is wrong. And then you start seeking a pathway to the people who have influence, even if you don't, that are still awake enough to see that this is wrong. And, in every toxic organization, there are still people, quite a few people, who actually know what the right thing is. But they've either gotten silent by habit or they've been silenced by fear. And as soon as one person asks that question, do you see what I see? It opens this space for the other person to go, I do see what you see. And I'm so glad that you see it too. And now there's two of you. The jump from 1 to 2 is exponential. But it isn't. It's actually a shorter jump to go from 2 to 4. And in every values initiative I've ever been part of, and I have them just like everybody else does in my life. I'm a professor at a very complicated university. Not everything goes according to the way you would like it to go, and you have some obligations to step up and try to get it right. I always think of it more. It's sort of like when you do what are those? You do a mail thing and you send a letter out, a chain letter. You do a chain letter of values. So you send this message to one other person, and they say yes, I see it. Then you say, would you go send that message to 2 people, and I'll send it to 2 people, and now I'll come back and we'll see how we did. So then now we got 6 people. And each of those 6 people send their values message out to 2 more people. And then pretty soon you get to have a meeting of the people. Now, maybe you have it at night in a
secret room
in a
somewhere
place that doesn't have the lights on. But then you've got a values initiative underway. And the last chapter in the book is called Choose to Lead. And you've chosen to lead. Now, you may not be a leader in like, I'm the vice president of whatever, but you're leading with values. And people have a way of responding to that. They have a way of, going, this is more important than what's going on out there. I want to be on the right side of this question. And so they want to join up. So I think the power of 2 is my first most practical and most effective, and the research shows that it completely empowers people in a whole different way when it comes to values. That's the first step to take.
The show's tagline this season is a movement for those seeking meaning. The underlying theme is that the quest for meaning, which includes ethics, creates connection. Whereas unethical behavior, as you're describing it, ultimately severs connection to prosperity, connection to each other, connection to trust. Trust is, to me, the underlying glue that builds a relationship. Unethical behavior rips that apart, even if there might be some sort of superficial trust that's created in propagating the unethical act. So, and the reason why I mention that is the rule of 2, which has this multiplier effect that you're talking about if those involved engage in it, really is recreating that ultimate human need that we have for connection around ethics and meaning. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes. Absolutely. And I mean, I would just add one dimension to that litany you just went through, and that is unethical behavior, becoming complicit in a toxic workplace or empowering a bully in the office, it cleaves you from yourself because you are a person of conscience. And when you act as if you're not, this dissonance sets in and you start disrespecting yourself. You start lacking confidence in the person that you are at your best. And you backed away from the opportunity to be expressive of that. And so next time another opportunity comes, you back away from it sooner. So it's a dialogue within yourself that you've injured and you've alienated yourself from. So I think a lot of why people respond when you speak up for values is it's healing for them within themselves. And people really crave that sense of integration, which is a sense of meaning and purpose. So it's the baseline. It's where it begins. I mean, you could have the most meaningful job in the world. You could be like an evangelical minister trying to save souls. And if you are conducting in a way that is unethical, then it all stinks. It all falls apart. You could have the most menial job in the world. You could be the janitor of a baseball park. And if you do it with a sense of integrity, meaning, social connection to the people there, you're awake to the values of compassion and justice. When you see a parent abusing a child in front of you, your life is meaningful as you live that day at the ballpark.
I was imagining this person and my heart was warming even thinking about him. Richard, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals have codes of ethics that we have to follow or risk losing licensure. Business people, on the other hand, do not need licenses. In fact, within businesses, codes are left up to individual companies to have or not, and some don't. Why is that, and do you think that that's a good thing?
Well, I think that if you look carefully at the professional codes of ethics, they all apply, for the most part, to what we call learned professions. So doctors, lawyers, they are professions that identify as professions. They have special status ranking hierarchies that are socially embedded in the way they do their practice. And once you get past that, even professors like me, there's no code of ethics for professors. There's each university might have a conflict of interest code or a behavioral code for students, but it's part of a contract. It's not part of a profession. And I think the reason is because all these other activities are so unregulated. They come in so many varieties with so many different kinds of variables in terms of people's backgrounds, in terms of what's required to do the work, that a code would just be, you'd have to rewrite it for every edition of what's happening. But I'll tell you what we've tried to do at Wharton, knowing that that's a problem. Because occasionally some of the business schools have actually tried to write a code and get their students to sign off on it, and they all fail. They become kind of jokes in a way. What we did, we created something we call the Commitment Project. And we asked students before they graduate to identify the 5 top values that they hold individually and to articulate those values on a short list. And then we ask them to come together, and they could be whatever the values that they are. We don't have we don't say pick from these 10, Then they ask them to come together before graduation, and they meet in a small group, a large group, but they meet in small tables. And they share with each other what their commitments are. And their commitments tend to be things like family, honesty, professional excellence, whether they're engineers or whatever they are. And they have to articulate them, and then they have to explain why they pick them to each other. They confess, they witness their own values. Then we give them a little medal embossed thing it looks like a business card, but it's actually made of metal. And it has their values printed on it for each individual. And we hand it to them and say, keep this. And you are the one who invented it. You're the one who has articulated it. It's your duty to live by these rules. And we send them off. And I think that's as close as we could come to having a professional values list that a business school can facilitate. But the students find it very meaningful.
I bet they do.
And they're very earnest about their discussion of it. And it makes it's a separate thing around graduation time. It's not part of the family celebration.
I have a personal obsession that I'm just going to reveal to you and to everyone who's watching or listening today. You're going to know one of my secrets. Okay. I have an obsession, and that obsession is with accepting choice in my life. Just the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine about her relationship with someone else in her family. And she was saying, I don't have a choice. I have to deal with this person this way. This person treats me like garbage, but I don't have a choice. I have to. This, that, and the other. And I kept saying, because I have this internal obsession, you have a choice. You have a choice. You just don't like the consequences of that choice. But you've got a choice. And the reason why I said that is because, and why this obsession of mine has intensified, has been that as I've interviewed various ethicists or done readings for this show, or just thought about it generally, yet another subtle theme that comes out over and over again is agency and the extreme extent to which we have it. We, you say, have choices that we can make in our workplaces, or I assume by extension in our personal lives, when little things happen that cross our conscience code. What are you telling us, if anything, taking that even further out, about the society's larger choices around the ethical behaviors of our leaders? And particularly in a free society like ours, I'm not talking about a tyranny where you truly your only choice may be to just die. But in a free society like ours, and a free economy, how we address leadership crises around ethics that we're facing systemically.
Yeah. I think the largest, you've just hit on the largest type of pressure problem that any individual can encounter. And you can get pressure from peers, you can get pressure from bosses, you can get pressure from your own, view of incentives and what you think you're have to do to get your paycheck. But the biggest one of all is the pressure of a system. And a system level pressure could come from a corrupt company. The whole company is a Ponzi scheme. It can come from a corrupt government. It can come from a corrupt religious community. But any individual who's in one of these systems thinks to themselves, what can I do? I'm up against something so bigger than me that I just, as you say, don't have a choice. And I think I take some comfort. You ever heard of the philosopher Hannah Arendt?
Tell us about Hannah Arendt. Please tell.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt wrote a lot about the Holocaust and Nazism and the complicity of Germans in the Holocaust during World War II, and she said that in a totalitarian system, which is the most corrupt system of all, where the people are the least empowered, she said, even thinking the right thought is an act of protest.
Wow.
And I think that as we grapple with large systems, we have to empower ourselves to think the right thoughts, not to let ourselves be gaslighted into brainwashing ourselves. So, and of course, once you think the right thought, there's a pretty good chance that you'll identify an action item that springs from that thought, and an opportunity to take action that otherwise would have not occurred to you because you weren't thinking that thought. And so, the Buddha at the beginning of the Dharmapada, the first line of the Dharmapada says, all that we are is the result of what we have thought.
Yes.
And so I think we begin in these extreme circumstances with right thoughts related to what the right value is, what the world would look like if it could look like the one that you want to live in. And then from those right thoughts, build out. But don't minimize the protest of right thought. Embrace the fact that you're having this right thought. Consider it courageous that you're having this right thought. Honor it, and then let it lead you.
Nothing is more gratifying about being a podcast host than having those moments where your framework inside shifts. Thank you for just giving me one of those moments, Richard. That was amazing. There is a very scary and weird little story in your book about a man who took some free train rides. Yeah. And that, to me, there's, again, a lot to take away from that little story that ended up not being so little. One thing that I'll take away from this is, suffice it to say, a man took a few too many free train rides. And yet he took that free train ride, it was a train ride, that first day. And he began to mentally walk down that slippery slope that ultimately took him to the seventh circle of financial hell. And not to mention ethical hell. How do I keep myself, or anyone who's listening or watching, from freaking out if we make the wrong choice like he did that first day? How do we just not consign ourselves to saying, well, I did that yesterday. Okay, I did that 365 days ago and every day since. I did that for 7 years. How do we deal with our own lapses? Because none of us are perfect. We're all going to make ethical choices that are wrong sometimes.
Sure. There's a reason why, just to clarify the story, this guy was a banker in the United Kingdom, and he managed to figure out how to get on his suburban train ride from a suburb and get into London without paying for it. And just sort of, he got a workaround that allowed him to take the ride for free. And then once he'd gotten away with it, he just formed a habit of getting away from it. And then he stopped thinking about it, and then he became entitled to have it for free. And then in the end, he was caught having owed the British rail system £46,000, and he was disbarred from the financial profession by the regulator in the UK because his theft was so gargantuan, and it proved that he was an untrustworthy financial advisor, and so they barred him from the industry. I think that's a great example of Hannah Arendt's point. What happened to him was he allowed a rationalization to become his thought. And the rationalization was, nobody will notice. It's like shoplifting. You find yourself in the store, you forgot your wallet, you need the toothpaste, you just sort of think, well, nobody will notice, and you put it in your purse and walk out. And so there you are, and you knew it was wrong, but you let the nobody will notice thought govern your behavior. And of course, Aristotle teaches us that virtue, just like exercise, is a habit. And as soon as you allow yourself to behave in a way that violates your own conscience, you form the habit of being unvirtuous. So the power of two helps. I know in my own life, I have a very, very loving partner, and looking at her and knowing that I just stolen some toothpaste from the Rite Aid, I think I would have such a strong sense of discontinuity and betrayal that I wouldn't. I'm not sure I could confess that I'd done it to her, but I would somehow find a way to get the toothpaste back into the store. and or make it right. Now, sometimes you misbehave, you do something wrong, and there's no way to put the toothpaste back. And I think at that point you need to recompense. You need to pay your dues back to get on the right side. And there's a reason why most religions have periodic worship services, and the Catholic Church has confession and absolution. These churches, way back when, the church's influence is waning, but they knew that people are sinners. They knew that people were inclined to give way to temptation, and they wanted to make sure that they could provide them with the means and the resiliency to continue with a virtuous life. And so they provided some rituals to help them. If we don't have that religious ritual, then I think we need to have the individual, humanistic, kind of moral renewal, where we realize we've done wrong and then we commit to doing right, and we show as a apology to the world, and of course no one else knows this is happening, by making a donation to some charity, or by doing some volunteer work, or by putting yourself out in some way that sort of rights the balance so that you get your sense of self back. And of course you make a commitment. This is really important. There's a wonderful quote in the book from Clay Christensen. He's passed away recently, but he's a colleague of mine from the Harvard Business School. He said, it's much easier to keep your principles 100% of the time than it is to keep them 98% of the time. And that's where rules help. You just have a rule: don't shoplift. So when you don't have your wallet, you go, well, I guess I better go home and get my wallet. It's just rule. And a lot of these things, like don't cheat on your subway fare, and don't do all these, don't take a handicap parking spot, and do, all these things that are just sort of day-to-day temptations to violate your own conscience. Just have rules and keep them. It's a lot easier to keep a rule than it is to go through an analysis every time about what the right thing to do is.
Do you believe, particularly in light of what you just said about some of these rituals that these historic religious institutions have had, that there is a connection between ethics and our personal spirituality?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's the deepest possible connection between those two things. The more self-aware you are of the spiritual side of your connection. Now, what is the spiritual side of your life? It's the side that connects you to all the things greater than yourself. It could be the experience of awe when you're in nature, or standing at the edge of an ocean. It could be the connection to silence in a place where there's just a profound silence. It could be the love that you experience when you see your child born. All those moments are connections. And it's the connection, that openness, the vulnerability. Because when you connect, you leave yourself wide open to being betrayed. And that's why it's so special that you are able to release that sense of protection and control and other things, and give it. If it's to God, you give it to God. If it's to your sense of your tradition or your culture, you give it to that. But it's giving it away.
Tell us a little bit about your own journey and why you say that with such passion.
Well, I mean, for myself, I was sort of involuntarily drawn to a life where values were very prominent, because in my 20s, I was a child of a Marine general. I mentioned that earlier, and his father was in the Army. My mother's father was in the Navy. My sister married a naval officer. There was no doubt in my family that I was going to be a military officer. It was just which academy I'd go to. But I was lucky enough to get a Navy scholarship, which meant I could go to some other college and still be a naval officer. But in the middle of my college years, the Vietnam War erupted in a particularly dramatic way, and I was swept into a new vortex where the values that I had assumed were the values that everybody had suddenly were called into dramatic and serious question. And And so I was called to decide whether I should go to Vietnam and kill people I had no quarrel with. And I came to conclude that I couldn't do it. And so I became a pacifist. And so if you can imagine a phone call between a 20-year-old son and his Marine Corps general father, that he was going to give up his Navy scholarship and become a war resister, you can imagine what I went through. And the moment that I made that call, I had a little speech I'd prepared, and I read it. And after I'd made my speech and I told him what I was doing, there was this long silence on his side of the phone. And then he said 3 words that I'll never forget, and that have guided me ever since. He said, "Are you sure?" And as a 20-year-old with a military background who was making a journey 360 degrees opposite to everything I'd ever known, I couldn't possibly be sure. But with him that night, I had to be sure. And I said, yes, I'm sure. And that committed me to a path where my values were going to be more important in that case than even my family and my family traditions and my culture and my duties as I had been taught them. And so, there was it was obviously a very disruptive experience, and it took me a long time to put my life back together again, because when you do something like that, the narrative, your story is completely disrupted. But I think from that experience and the time and the years that followed, as I investigated myself more thoroughly, I lived in Buddhist monasteries in different parts of the world. I was actually invited to be a Buddhist monk in South Korea. I learned what the inner life really is, and I learned how important it is to be at peace with it.
Talk to us a little bit about your experience as a monk and as a trigger for your development into who and what you've become today.
Well, it's Buddhist meditation, so there's many different spiritual disciplines, and I'd investigated most of them by that time. I lived in Israel. I read the whole Bible. I'd done a whole investigation of Hinduism, and what came to me as I sat in Buddhist meditation in this very quiet monastery in Sri Lanka was the impermanence of my thoughts, my feelings, my mental experience, sensations. I suddenly became aware of the sort of larger picture of how humans fit into nature and how all of it is in constant motion, and that our little speck that we call ourselves, me, is just pretty trivial claim against what's really going on most of the time out there. And I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, after the meditation, I became better and more skilled at it. My monk advisor, my teacher, one day sent me into the forest. I'd had a particularly difficult week. And he sent me into the forest next to the monastery. It's a sort of a rainforest, a beautiful place, not quite a jungle, but. And as I walked through the jungle, I looked on the floor that I was walking on, the floor of the forest, and I noticed for the first time that everything on the forest floor was either dead or alive, and that it was the dead things that were feeding the living things, and that without death you couldn't have life. And I had this. It was like all the big puzzles of life had been this book, and it had been written in some code that I couldn't understand. And then as I looked at the forest floor, the code suddenly became clear. And I sat down under a tree and I wept. It was such a powerful truth. And I think fundamentally spiritual life is about coming to terms with death. And if you're reconciled to death, one way or the other, I'm not going to confuse this by saying there's an afterlife, there isn't, whatever. But when you're reconciled to death, then you're released to be of service to others. And if you're not reconciled to death, then you spend your life protecting yourself. And so I think that little seed was where everything else has grown from.
Richard, what a wonderful way to lead into what is, unfortunately, the last question of the show today, which is the following. If I have no spirituality, how can I find my own conscience code?
Well, I think that it starts, I'll go back to connection. Because I think if you're looking for one anchor to ground a code of behavior in, a code of conduct, it's in connection. And in your duty to protect the innocent, to be compassionate about suffering, and to be willing to allow yourself to have as part of your purpose in life to take opportunities that present themselves. You don't have to go looking for them. Just opportunities that present themselves to be of service to others, to relieve suffering, and to be of service. And if that's, I don't think you need to have a deep religious background to have those instincts. Humans are social creatures. I think we're kind of evolutionarily programmed to have that value. I think once you start down the path of doing that, spiritual insights will follow.
In other words, you will begin to go down the purpose highway.
Okay.
How was that for us?
Wow, that's really good, Scott. I think that's really good. All right, excellent. And, and I would just add to it that there are probably 47 million highways, and all you have to do is go down one of them.
Yes. Richard, the conversation has been extraordinary. How can people find out more about you? And let me please plug, I'm going to just pull it up now for those that are watching, your book, The Conscience Code. Really, I don't go crazy about a book like this that often on the show, but I feel compelled to here. How can people find out more about you?
I'm pretty simple. If you look on the web, Richard Schell, to Shell, you'll find my Wharton website, my faculty website, which links to my personal website, which is grichardsschell.com. But you don't have to remember that. You just have to remember Richard Schell Wharton. And you'll find out all of the information on my other books, on me, on my journey, and on what I do at Wharton, and they're, what I've written. So I think I'm pretty simple.
I love
that
it.
Way.
Simplicity is a beautiful thing. Richard, it has been great taking a ride with you today. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone tuning in, if you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple or a comment on YouTube. And see you next time for another trip down the Purpose Highway. When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA crafts small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's NOLA's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's NOLA is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's ITSNOLA.com. guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's Nola's website for yourself and find out how good it is.